Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much for being with us as we gather together not only here at the Church of St. Andrew in Scarborough, but in other sites as well, for the York Scarborough area afternoon. I'm just going to call it an area day, an area afternoon on the issue of medical assistance in dying. Many of you, I think, have been part of conversations in church life and in your broader lives, in secular society, perhaps in your own communities, in your own families. And I'm grateful that a number of you have gathered here at St. Andrews. We have a satellite site at the Church of the Incarnation, a little bit further west of here. And I'm also aware that a number of people are joining us, perhaps from their own homes, and are tuning in. I want to say a word of thanks to our organizing committee and the Reverend Tay Moss, who is responsible for the live streaming of this event to allow people to tune in from various places. They hopefully can see and hear what all of you in the room are seeing and hearing as we gather. Thank you very much. I also understand that if people have missed this live, they can also go to our YouTube channel and watch this again. So if you go back home, back to your own parish communities, and people say, really wish that I had been able to go to that, let them know that they can go to YouTube and watch it and listen to it again. I also want to say a word of thanks to Dr. Walter Deller, who's also been instrumental in pulling together this day, and the various speakers, and also to the Reverend Jeanette Lewis. The three of them have worked very hard over the past several weeks and months in planning this afternoon, so thanks to the three of you. I also want to say a brief word of introduction to our four speakers who are here. There is a fairly comprehensive biography for the four of you at all of the tables, so I'm not going to say too much about the four speakers. They are going to speak, obviously, today, and you can also read more about them in the material that you've been given. Our four speakers are the Reverend Canon Eric Beresford. Eric is a priest of the Diocese of Toronto, the incumbent of the Church of St. Timothy in North Toronto. He is also, I think, and I think others would say so too, our primary ethicist in the Anglican Church of Canada, and has been responsible for previous documents and previous research on this topic of medical assistance in dying back in the year 2000, I think, the Care in Dying document, and then more recently, Ensure and Certain Hope, and he joins us today, and you can read more about him. Jan Goddard is a lawyer and practices law, and is also an acquaintance, I think, of our Chancellor, Canon Burns. And Jan is going to speak as well. She is, I gather, an expert in many things, but one of her areas of interest and expertise is elder law. And Jan, we welcome you today. The Reverend Canon Doug Graydon. Douglas is also a priest of the Diocese of Toronto and has been for many years, and has served as the coordinator of chaplaincy services for the diocese, and is something of an expert not only in parish ministry, but is also a pastoral care practitioner and something of an expert in chaplaincy. Douglas, we welcome you. And then finally, Dr. Coranon, a parishioner at St. Cuthbert's Leaside. Am I right about that? Dr. Coranon is a family physician, and I gather has spent considerable time in long-term care and the care of older people and geriatrics, and we welcome Dr. Coranon here as well today. A few housekeeping issues before we begin. The washrooms, for those of you who are in the room. I can't give any information about the washrooms for those of you who are tuning in elsewhere. For those, if you're here at St. Andrews, the washrooms are out that door. If you came this way, come through this end of the hall, up the stairs, and there are washrooms on that level. There are exits at the back of the room and also at the front of the room. Again, welcome to the Reverend Heather Gwynn Timothy, who has assembled a group of people at her parish, the Church of the Incarnation. We welcome you. And wherever you are, whether you're in the room or joining us by live stream, please remain seated as we pray. Loving God, we thank you for drawing us here today. We thank you for the leading of your Holy Spirit as we gather to hear and discuss in prayerful discernment the for those who are medical practitioners and ethicists, for parish clergy and legal authorities on this. And we pray that you may guide all of us today, wherever we may be, as we come to discuss this very important matter. Pray for those who are dying. Pray for their family members and friends. Pray that you will surround them in your love and hold before us always the hope of resurrection, which we celebrate in this Easter season. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our risen Lord. Amen. Realize that at the beginning of this, those of you I didn't introduce myself, my name is Canon, I'm the area bishop of York School, and across the Diocese of Toronto, in each of the 4 episcopal areas, not necessarily today, but clergy and lay people are gathering to discuss this issue and the issues surrounding it as we are today. So we gather today alongside them, and we gather as diocese, clergy and lay people around this important issue. I'm going to ask the Reverend Jennifer Schick if she would come forward and read a passage from the book of Job. It's a bit of a dark passage, but I think it may set the tone for our conversation today, the seriousness of the conversation, but also grounds us in the scriptures.
A reading from the book of Job. This Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds settle upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the numbers of the months. Yes, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it. Let those who curse it, who curse the sea, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none. May it not see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide troubles from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why were there knees to receive me, or breasts for me to suck? Now I would be lying down and quiet. I would be asleep. Then I would be at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuild ruins for themselves, or with princes who have gold or fill their houses with silver. Or why was I not buried like a stillborn child, like an infant who never sees the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slaves are free from their masters. Why is light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? For my sign comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Yes, it is depressing. Okay, we thought we'd start with giving you about 10 minutes to turn to a person next to to you in groups of 2 or 3, whatever you're comfortable with, and just talk about why you came today. What made you come to this event? What was important enough to give up your beautiful Saturday afternoon to come sit in the church basement to talk about? So you'll have 10 minutes. At 25 to, we'll call you back. And
So if I could break into your conversations, I'm Walter Deller, one of the planners of the event. In planning the event, we knew that we wanted to invite a panel of experts, and that they will have things that they want to say and perspectives on this that they will want to share that are very important. But we also know that you come with questions of your own, and that as it unfolds, you may have more questions. And so we're going to try something which may or may not work as a process, but we hope will, because we want to try to use the time that we have available as effectively as possible. So on your table you will find a pad of post-it notes. And you may want to divvy them up. And what I'd like to invite you to do right now, each of you, just to put not a long essay, but just a short question. What's a question you have at this point in the day before we've really gotten into the depths of the stuff? What's a question you have? And I just want you to kind of keep that. After we've heard from Eric, I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you to look at your question. Say, have I got some answers to that? You may want to keep your question, you may want to add a new question, or at any time as things are going on, if a question comes to you. We also invite the people who are at Church of the Incarnation. I think you have an email address that you can send us questions as well. I'm going to start circulating the room then, as the other panelists are speaking. And if you have questions at that point, just like you to hold them up, and I'm going to collect them. And I'm going to collate them and try to see if we can reduce the body of questions into 2 or 3 key questions that we can then pose back to the panelists later. So hopefully this will work, and it may be completely crazy, but you know, if we never tried anything crazy, where would you? So I think it's time now to pass over to Eric Beresford, who was part of the group that authored the National Church, the most recent National Church report on this. And Eric will share, I think, some of the history of our churches grappling with these questions, and also some of the important definitions from that report. Thank you, Eric.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is there life in this room? I'm not sure. Try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. I know that reading from Job was a little bit heavy, but I think we can. Away from me a little bit. I think we can. Am I still registering on there?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we can move on from that. So I've been asked to sort of talk a little bit about the background of how we got to where we are in this conversation, in order to set a context as we think about our current legal and medical reality and situation. And let me say right up front, this is a relatively modern debate. Of course there were historical precedents, but those precedents are rarely, if ever, exact. The debate as we now see it began in the middle of the and into the second half of the 20th century. And from the very beginning, that debate has been dominated by confusion of definitions. And that's why I think there was the intention of providing people with the definitions which you see in front of you. And it's like a 4-page document. The first page I'm not going to touch, because those are legal definitions and I'm not a lawyer. And I don't, therefore, pretend any expertise to talk about those. The next 3 pages are taken essentially from the resource of Ensure and Certain Hope, and I'll come back and speak about that in a while. But they are the definitions with which that task group was working as it went to prepare that document. Now, I don't intend to use all of these definitions, or all of them. I think that would take too long. I also want to say that definitions were written before the Act was promulgated. So there are a few things which are a little different than they are in the law. I want to say something about a few of them, just because they're areas of a puzzle or of misunderstanding and so on. I'm going to start with autonomy. We all know what autonomy means, don't we? Our capacity to be the authors of our own actions, to make free choices. Well, of course, that's what we mean by autonomy, but the minute you start to prod that definition, it becomes considerably less clear. I'm sure we've all heard certain males from time to time describe themselves as self-made men. My response is always, oh, I've never met one before. Every other time they have others. We're not self-made men. We're not actors who act independently of the forces that work upon us. We're not people who, whose imaginations are formed solely inside our own heads. We are people who live in community, who are born in community, who live in community, who are shaped by community, who are shaped by the influences upon them. And one of the challenges in this whole area, therefore, is having an account of autonomy that is adequate to the real human experience of autonomy, as opposed to certain mythologized versions. The next one I marked for myself was brain death. That might seem an odd one to do, but you'd be surprised how much confusion went on around that one. Even today, I was told a story of a family who were declining to have a loved one removed from a ventilator because they don't believe that that should be taken out of God's hands. Well, all sorts of things one can say about that, but the reason the individual's on a ventilator is because he's brain dead. That means the death of the entire brain, including the brain stem. Removing that individual from the ventilator is not actually going to kill them. You can't kill the dead. Doctrine of double effect. The next one I just want to very quickly move to. Important because our actions often have consequences in addition to, or even other than, those that are intended. This has been an interesting area within the debate because one of the reasons that, for example, rejection of a distinction between passive and active euthanasia was suggested. It's also one of the reasons why it's sometimes suggested that certain actions are in effect euthanasia. The classic being the use of pain medication, which may possibly depress respiration and shorten life. Well, I mean, apart from going into the evidence as to whether or not that actually happens, the point I simply want to make here is that when you're thinking about double effect, when you're thinking about the multiple consequences of our actions, as human beings we need to include some reference to what we call intentionality, to the intention which is behind our actions. So if one of you comes up to me and hits me in the knee, and I kick you, that was probably not an action, it was a reflex. If, however, I just walk up to you and kick you, that was probably an action. What's the difference between the two? Well, a reflex is something I don't intend. A reflex is not an action because it's not a decided, intended action of a conscious agent. What that means, therefore, is that you have a different moral status. If I kick you because you hit the tendon in my knee, you can't get too upset with me. I didn't intend anything. In fact, you caused it. If I kick you because I just come up and kick you, then you have every reason to be annoyed, because that was an action for which I am responsible. Another one here I want to quickly draw attention is this notion of extraordinary treatment. This is actually a concept that goes back to the 1960s and to papal documents, surprisingly, which distinguished between ordinary and extraordinary treatment. Basically, extraordinary treatments are those which are highly unlikely to be effective and very invasive. I don't really want to go any further than that. Palliative care is an interesting one because I've seen palliative care in a number of different contexts. When I was first ordained in England, actually the first pastoral visit I ever made, I was sent on to St. John's Hospice, which was about 3 miles away from the church I was serving, and got in there and sat down. I was 23 at the time, brand new ordinand, and sat down with a woman in the hospice who said to me, her opening line was, you know, I don't know what I'm doing here. Everybody else in here is dying. Well, it was kind of an interesting context to be thrown into. But what made it possible to move beyond that was the palliative care context where she was. My experience in Canada is that the provision of medical care in palliative care context is superb. What is complicated is often it is difficult to extend that to psychosocial, spiritual care of the patient and family. And that was the original conception behind palliative care. And I would simply want to observe it's very difficult to do in a shared room, frankly. You can do the medical care, and I repeat, the medical care I've seen has been superlative, but you can't do the psychosocial, spiritual, and you can't do the care of both the patient and their family in that context. So that really raises some issues, and it was there in the court case, because one of the reasons why palliative care got tossed out as an issue early on was because the judge simply asked, so is this what's being provided for people? And the answer was overwhelmingly no. So that is not relevant as evidence. Suffering. Suffering is an interesting one because suffering and pain are two different things. You can have no pain, but still suffer. Suffering refers to quality of life. It's a subjective assessment of a lack that's there. It can therefore include not just pain, but also privation, the lack of opportunities to live life to the full, the lack of mobility, all sorts of other things need to be in there. Last thing of these, sorry, I was just asked to run over these, so that's what I'm doing. Termination of treatment, withdrawal of treatment. Again, sometimes expressed as passive euthanasia. I would argue it is not, because the intention is not the end of the life of the patient. The intention is to withdraw treatment that is ineffective, unhelpful, often invasive, and unwelcome. So those are just some quick definitions. In running you very quickly through these, I think my only point, and the thing that I would hope that would be a take-home for you, is the realization that we need to be very careful about the terms we use. We need to be very precise. And that's why you have multiple people here today who bring different experiences and can bring some precision to those conversations. Returning to the narrative that really interests me, let me just say, this isn't just about history, it's about story. And I think story is hugely important to who we are as the people of God, and story is hugely important to ethical reflection. There are forms of ethical reflection which imagine that all you need to do is trot out the appropriate principles, lay them as a grid over the problem, and out will come your solution, what you should do. There are several difficulties with that approach to ethics. On the one hand, it actually hides the interpretive task that's going on when I decide this is the sort of situation where these principles appropriately apply and these do not. More than that, it's an approach to ethical decision-making which tends to come late. In other words, it arrives late on in the process of the situation, and it arrives when already the options are very limited. Not infrequently to two. So as an approach to ethical decision-making, it is problematic. Story, on the other hand, reminds us that our ethical decision-making takes place within communities. who tell those stories. And for us, that is the story of God's dealings with God's people over time and in our own context. It reminds us that our moral decision-making is always linked to the context within which we are thinking and within which we are making decisions. It's not abstract. It's real and it's involved. And saying that helps, I think, to understand the journey which the Church has taken. The Anglican Church of Canada has actually given two major interventions into this area. The first was a document called Care in Dying, which was commended by the General Synod in 1998, along with a statement. Care in Dying was written in the context of a live debate. There was a debate going on within our society about the appropriateness or not of medical assistance in dying. Debate not just in our society, but also within our church. Care in Dying offers what I would call as a cautiously negative assessment of whether or not it would help to legalize medical assistance in dying. Although it suggests that the weight of evidence falls against legalizing, it admits that many of the arguments traditionally used are not as clear-cut as is often assumed. It acknowledges that there is a range of opinion in the life of the Church, and it tries to suggest a way forward that might be something which those in favour of medical assistance in dying and those opposed could actually make good use of, namely the notion of care, and I'll come back to that in a little while. In Sure and Certain Hope, and I was delighted that Doug Graydon was one of my colleagues on using that document, part of the task group that worked on that, was written in a completely different context. The court case of Carter and the Crown had actually been Canada had been decided in February of 2015. Bill C-14, I think, was still in the works. It actually hadn't been written when. That's right. Yeah, was still in the works. That's right, because it came out about the time we finished our work. The point is, it was a completely different context. It was a context in which the aim could no longer be to argue for a legal position in a society, but to find ways of providing pastoral support to individuals involved in these decisions, and perhaps to foster changes to the health system that might mitigate the negative impacts of the change. There were a number of things in common between those two documents. The first is the affirmation that life is a good and a source of gratitude. But it's not an ultimate good. It's not the only good to be pursued regardless of all else. Both documents agree that the biblical materials do not directly address the situation that we're talking about and need to be used with great care, especially if we're trying to use them to persuade others of a perspective. For example, the biblical materials around suicide, suffering, the notion of life as a gift. All of them need to be thought about with greater care than is often the case. Life is a gift, absolutely. But are we seriously expected to believe that any good giver, like God, would expect us to keep hold of a gift that has become toxic to us? Life is in God's hands, absolutely. But then God has shared the work of those hands with us. I'm always amazed when people talk about playing God. But in an odd way, that's precisely the human vocation. The human vocation is to be creative co-creators with God. At least Walter can correct me, but that's what I take from Genesis. But we're called to participate in the work which God sets going. Suffering is part of God's purposes. Absolutely, redemptive suffering is. But I'm really reluctant to use that to say that every and all examples of suffering are redemptive and therefore should simply be allowed to continue. The key principle in both is the obligation to care And the overriding concern in both is that abandonment is not acceptable. Saying all of this does not end the need for advocacy. So what advocacy should we be engaged in? Well, according to that latest document, one of the questions is the adequacy of palliative care in our context. In saying this, in no way intend to criticize palliative care physicians, palliative care staff, those who work very hard in those contexts. But as I've already said, the problem is the context makes their work harder and indeed means that certain aspects of palliative care, the social, psychological and spiritual, are very difficult to address. We need to have a better and more robust understanding of human decision makers. The understanding of what it means to be human decision making that I read in the Act, in Bill C-14, is what I would call the Kantian moral agent. It is somebody who is detached, disembodied, has no social or relational roots. There's no reference in the Act or in the judgment to families at any point. Who is even to some degree atemporal, who sits outside it all and looks at it rationally and seeks to make a rational decision. Sounds great, but I've never met such an agent, and I don't actually ever expect to. The important thing is, and this I think is the huge opportunity for the church in the midst of it all, is that all of our human realities are in the end relational. And what we can bring to the situation is that relationship and the capacity and possibility for relationship. 3 times since 2016 I've been asked to accompany people in my parish on the journey which was to include me. What's fascinating to me is each of those requests came with the opening statement, Eric, I know you're going to be upset, but... Well, the only thing upset was that people assumed we'd be upset. Because that put me on the back foot. It made it very difficult for me then to enter the pastoral situation positively and proactively. It meant that there was a suspicion of what I might have to bring. And primarily what I had to bring was the recognition that the person who is making this decision is part of a community. They're part of the community of their family, and that's important. And so encouraging the conversations within the family, so the family are not bereft in the middle of all of this, because conversations didn't happen that needed to happen. Part of the reality is also the family of the church, and bringing that to bear in the situation. So, I mean, I really, for clergy, I want to draw you back to the resources we have. Prayers for the dying, the reading of Scripture, the use of anointing and Eucharist, last rites. These are incredibly powerful symbolic representations of the ongoing life of the community, which continues in and to the life of the person who is dying. Rowan Williams, in his latest book, Christ, the Heart of Creation, says, Christian ethics is not about dramatic and solitary choices for individual good or evil, but the steady building of a culture of durable mutuality and compassion. And that, I believe, is key. The more we turn to this issue, from the point of view of some set of abstract philosophical or theological principles, the more of a mess we'll get ourselves into. And the harder it will be to see our own space within the conversation. Last, how am I doing for time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Plenty of time. I just want to conclude by saying some things about this notion of care. And I want to do that because actually this notion of care is very difficult to think about with clarity. Why is that? Well, when we care deeply for somebody who is suffering, who is in pain, who is approaching the end of their life, who is dying, there is grief. Even before death, there is grief. There is this impending sense of loss. There is the hurt. And there are all sorts of things which have grown in a lifetime of relationship. And wondering how and when they can be addressed. And because of all that stuff, it is extraordinarily difficult, A, to disentangle my pain from the pain of the person who is dying, and B, to be clear about what it is that disturbs us. How are we to untangle our needs from theirs? When I am concerned about somebody's suffering, is it actually their suffering I'm concerned about? Is it my suffering I'm concerned about? Is it some combination of the two? I suspect it's the latter. So that's the first thing. It's very difficult to unentangle this lot. And the reality is that human beings have one enormous gift: the capacity for illusion. The capacity to deceive ourselves about our own motives and why we're doing things. And it's actually helpful much of the time. It stops us becoming completely neurotic. But it's also destructive. The aptitude for illusion means that we will often fail to see our own motivations. It's perhaps why Rowan Williams very much sees, and it's one of the central themes of his writing, the importance of disillusionment as the first part of our encounter with God. Until we strip ourselves of all those things that make us comfortable and therefore mean that we don't need God, we're never really going to encounter God. And so we need to be able to go through that process. Care is difficult. It's one of the things that we cannot let go of. Care is difficult because it can draw us into actions that are intended as expressions of care, but actually function to protect myself. Care is difficult because in order to do it well, we have to pay attention with exquisite detail. And we need to go right into the situation in which we're being drawn. I just want to say here that I was immensely grateful on our committee for some of the things which Doug drew to our attention around those issues and being open to and aware of them. So then, the call to care. What does that mean? In Care and Dying, the assumption was it meant that we could not have somebody in medical assistance in dying, that was to some degree an abandonment. I'm not sure I can hold that position any longer, that I've held it for a while. The bigger abandonment is to say that I won't care for you if you choose something I don't approve of. I won't care for you if you go in a direction that makes me uncomfortable. So care, it seems to me, has to be centered around the person we care for and has to be willing to stay in the room, to stay in the company, to stay on the journey, even if it's a journey we wouldn't choose. I think I finished my 5 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'm getting the hook on.
Thank you, Eric, for setting out a range of considerations for us as we begin to focus our thoughts. So I'd invite you again, if you've got some questions that are beginning to percolate up, we know we're going to hear from each of the panelists in turn over the next half hour or so, and then we hope to have some conversation among the panelists, but we also hope to begin to feed in our questions from the room and from Church of the Incarnation. So if you have a question at this point and want to hold it up, I'm going to begin circulating the room, and there are some questions from Incarnation, and then I'll begin to collate them. And you're going to, so you want to wave?
There's a wave here, and Heather has been emailing in questions for us while Eric was talking. So we now invite Dr. Coranon to speak for 10 minutes or so to talk to you. And I believe you have a presentation as well.
So I'm going to have to ask you to move the slide so I know what I'm talking about. Okay, just so you know, I'm a family doctor, but I also do long-term care. So in both situations, I am dealing with people that are terminally ill. But one part of my presentation, can you flip this?
Yep.
The slide go. And next, you've already seen my joke. Okay. We're going to talk, and we're going to have also lawyers talking about living wills. It's a tool for providing your end-of-life wishes to your power of attorney. It is not a legal document, is the major thing. Next slide, please. So, but in living wills, one of the important things, and I think this is the big thing that I'm going to be pushing to people today, is asking you, do you have powers of attorney? And where is it, number one? Same as where is your will? Does your family have access to it? And have you discussed with your family what your wishes are? In other words, do you want to be resuscitated if you have a cardiac arrest? Or do you want to be kept alive with a tube feed? Which to me, I said, I'm going to get 2 tattoos in my lifetime. One is a paddle with an X through it, and the other one is a G tube, which is a tube feed with an X through it. So nobody does that to me, let me tell you. Okay. And then what I was going to talk about is passive euthanasia versus me. Have you discussed all of this with your power of attorney and family? This is a biggie because unless families really know what your wishes are, it puts them in a very difficult position. And especially, I can talk about doing long-term care where we have 5 children and 4 agree with what they think mom wanted. But the 5th one is, oh, too much, let me tell you. Okay? And do you have a power of attorney who will support your decisions? In other words, if you have a power of attorney, have you discussed it so they know exactly what you want? Next slide, please. Next slide. There it goes. Okay. So let's go back one.
This one?
Look, you flip 2.
You flip, no.
Okay, next. There. Okay, oh, sorry. Okay, so medical assistant died, must be at least 18 years of age, capable of making decisions with respect, have a grievous and a remedial medical condition. So if I was suicidal, that doesn't mean that I have a grievous and incurable illness, because if I have severe depression, that's treatable. So that's not a reason to consider that I should have me. You also have to have the ability to make a voluntary request for medical assistance in dying. That's not a result of external pressure. What that means is that your children are pushing for it even though you don't want to have made. Okay, it's an easy example. Or, other pressures from that point of view. You have to want to have it done. Next slide, please. It must be a state of decline that causes enduring physical or psychological suffering that's intolerable to the individual and cannot be relieved under conditions that the individual considers acceptable. The second thing is natural death has become foreseeable, taking into account all medical circumstances without a specific length of time that the individual has to live. I love people coming into long-term care and the person does become ill and the family will always say to me, how much longer? I don't know. Okay. And I will tell you that sometimes I will see someone and think, well, they're deteriorating. And I walk in the next day and they've died. I did not expect it to happen at all. And yet there's other people that I say, for sure it's going to happen in the next 24 hours. We put them on what I call end-of-life care. And 3 months later, they're still trucking. So there's no way of telling, okay? So I'm just making that comment. Can we go to the next slide? What happens if the person has made the decision? It depends on the attending physician's personal feelings. In Ontario, there's a central registry that a physician can contact and they will take over. So in other words, if I'm not comfortable making the decision to actually do the deed, then I can go to the central registry. There are physicians that will come in, assess the person to see if this is truly what they want. There's a 10-day window after the individual is assessed before the procedure. This allows time for the individual to change their mind or be comfortable with their decision. Every case is performed requires the coroner to follow up afterwards. In other words, it's a coroner's case. Okay, that's the standard, and the death certificate is done by the coroner as well. Next step. Next, sorry. Now, it's important to say that palliative care physicians aren't necessarily the physicians who are involved. Their focus is maintaining comfort and pain relief, and did not feel that this should be their focus. So it's also important to understand that. Next slide. Most often seen, so passive euthanasia is most often seen in long-term care, or if someone's being cared for at home. Now that means, from that point of view, that you make sure that the person is comfortable, but in long-term care we don't have intravenous's. We may not set up tube feeds, okay? We may withdraw antibiotics if the person doesn't, the family chooses. But our major focus is to make sure the person goes comfortably into the night, but not doing heroic, sending them out to hospital, having IVs or having tube feeds put in. And that's where I'm pushing for people to make sure that in your power of attorney, that they know what you want. Next slide. The power to, okay, what if the person is not capable to understand and communicate? The power of attorney who must make decisions relying on the living will if it's available. They can do that, but they can also not do that. I think that's the other issue, okay? And MAID cannot be performed in someone who is cognitively impaired. Okay, that's an important comment to make too. Okay, so it's only the person that's competent that can make that decision. A good example, and I just was at a conference where they were talking about this, people that have ALS, do you know what I mean by that? Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where they could be put on respirators to be kept alive. But most people with that, 60% of the people have chosen to have MAID. And this is people that are doing the care for these people, just as a side comment. Next slide. So, okay, so I'm asking, what have you done? Do you have living wills? Do you have powers of attorney? Be clear about your wishes. Prolong life at all costs or go gently into the night. Make sure you communicate your choices with everyone that's significant to you. Just so that you know about powers of attorney, I'm just going to, I'll come back to the source. There's an article called Speak Up, and you can go to www.advancedcareplanning.ca, and it's a whole booklet explaining about doing advanced care planning. So that's one thing that you can do. You can go on to the Attorney General's website. They have powers of attorney as well. Understand there's powers of attorney for personal care. There's powers of attorney for finances as well. But I think the major thing that I'm pushing is please, 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 make sure that you, can I ask, does everybody here have a power of attorney? Everybody put up their hand, let's see. You passed. I'm proud of you. But I see one lady who didn't put up her hand. So I'm asking that people do that. That's my skill, okay?
You want to keep writing your questions as our speakers come to the podium and raise them up at the end, and Walter will pick them up. Now ask Reverend Canon Doug Graydon to do a little spiel for us about pastoral care. I don't think he has slides.
I'm a good player if I just do it.
Did you wish me that?
I think so. So when I was asked to come here, I wondered what contributions I could make. And I've kind of decided to bring the following. They're based on my experience of end-of-life care, where I spent the majority of my ministry, and the numerous conversations that I've had with patients around the termination of their care and the bringing about of their death. Most of that happened in Casey House during the days when HIV and AIDS was a much more catastrophic disease than it is now. And the dying process were particularly horrific, and there was great desire to bring life to an end in those kind of circumstances. But also within my time as coordinator of chaplaincy services, and then also working on the Ensure and Certain Hope document, of which the interest for me was the chapter on pastoral care, and
what I've learned in my experience, which I share with you, and you can query and challenge me when the time comes. So in the document, you'll find that the thrust of pastoral care is around what we understand to be a ministry of presence, which has an extraordinary wide interpretation. But basically what my experience and other chaplains' experiences of ministry of presence is where we enter into an environment where there is the patient or the client or the family, and our primary task is to see if we can find the God who is already there. That we don't bring an Anglican God into the room, that we don't bring our own perceptions or our own thoughts or moral codes, but we stop and pause and search out the God that is already there. Quite often this is best understood of falling within the kind of theoretical framework when it comes to pastoral counseling of unconditional regard, where you have a regard for the person that you're being called to be with, and it is unconditional. You come without conditions. You come with an open mind and an open heart. You don't come with what you think or what are your preconceptions as to what God teaches us or what our tradition teaches us or what we think our role in the community should be. But we come in a profound and deep state of mind to listen and to search and to respond. Over the last few years in clinical care, there has been kind of a renaissance in spiritual care, and it's being picked up by clinicians and not necessarily chaplains or spiritual care guides, as sometimes they are called today. And it's the understanding that there is a spectrum of spiritual wellness, and that the goal of good spiritual care intervention is to move the person from spiritual pain towards spiritual well-being. Existential pain is extremely difficult to manage and extremely difficult to develop care plans around and help people move, because it involves almost exclusively understandings and interpretations of meaning. What is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose? What is my role now? Do I have value? Those are deeply individual meanings and values and understandings of self, which are very difficult to change or influence or help people find their way back to a sense of spiritual well-being. One end of the spectrum of spiritual pain is a sense, profound senses of meaninglessness and hopelessness. Spiritual well-being, of course, has enhanced feelings of being connected to community, to relationships, and of course having a clarity of personal meaning and validity. There are all sorts of diagnostic tools now available to many people. The one that I used quite often and found really nifty was one developed for physicians called the FICA Spiritual Assessment Tool, of which it really only had 4 parts, and that kind of covers what spiritual care, especially in end-of-life care, might be all about. FICA, F, the first word, questions around faith, belief, and meaning. So what the person understands all of that to mean. I, in FICA, importance and influence. What is the importance of those? What is the importance of faith, of belief, and of meaning? Getting to the C, ask questions about the person's sense of community. Where do they come from? Where do they gather their energy from? Where do they get the greatest sense of meaning and purpose within? And finally, A, to try to begin to address the questions that are raised. So when it comes to medical assistance in dying, I think a fundamental part of it is the person's individual search. Not only is it okay? Is it valid for me? Is it worth my consideration? What will my family or circle of friends think about it? Can I maintain my own sense of integrity and authenticity while engaging in that? I think the other thing that I learned that I wanted to highlight for you is The difference, and here's where I sometimes think the church could challenge itself and do some rethinking in its theology, is what I learned or understood to be the difference between voluntary and involuntary suffering. A lot of our Christian, our faith tradition is built upon the concept of suffering. As Christ suffered, so shall I. The more I suffer, the better a Christian I am. As Christ suffered to the point of giving his life for me, therefore I should be able to embrace and tolerate my own suffering. That's how I exercise my faith. I can remember when I worked in community health care, there was a nurse that I worked with for many, many years who had the platitude of saying to patients that God only gives you what you can bear. And of course, that's not very good theology in my mind, but that's a theology that suggests that suffering is appropriate, and we're not really called to do much about tending to that. Suffering is intensely personal. There's no way you or I should even begin to interpret another person's suffering. All we should do is just simply be present to it. Voluntary suffering, we engage in voluntary suffering in all sorts of different ways. We engage in chemotherapy when we're diagnosed with cancer. We are willing to go through that suffering for a greater good at the end. Involuntary suffering is where I see someone, or the healthcare system, or a family friend, or a partner says, but I don't want you to do this. And then therefore, you set up the equation where the person engages in suffering to meet the needs of others, and not necessarily tending to the needs of the person who actually is suffering. I don't think we, as a community of faith, are in the business to foster involuntary suffering. But sadly, I think an awful lot of clergy do. Anecdotally, I hear stories of clergy who refuse to allow conversations around MAID in their congregations, who refuse to talk about it or lift it up in prayer. And there are all sorts of other circumstances when people are encouraged to suffer by our unwillingness to listen. So I think the Ensure and Certain Hope is a document that should, if it's functioning well, only begin the conversation within any kind of community, whether it's a family or a congregation or a diocese as a whole or a national church. But I think the premise around Ensure and Certain Hope is that we start from a position to listen, and to listen well, and to listen constructively, and to look for the meaning that is already there. Thank you.
If you have any more questions, write them down and send them by mail or all to get his exercise. And I'd like to ask our last speaker, Jan Goddard, if she would come to the podium to speak. After Jan has spoken, we'll take about 5-10 minutes. Please help yourself to some refreshments and a break if you need it for about 5-10 minutes after she's finished.
Well, thank you very much for welcoming me here today to speak to you. But I realize I stand between you and the snacks. And I have the challenge of talking to you about a fairly complicated area of law in 10 minutes. My caveat to you at the beginning is that I have boiled down what I have to say to you in this presentation to about 20 to 25% of what is even just in the criminal code about this, let alone some of the other legal issues that arise from the regime we now have that permits medical assistance in dying. And I also want to say to you that I say this all the time to clients. Law is a crude tool with which to address human problems. So the law is not an answer. The law is a framework in which we have to try and fit our problems or our motives or what we want to do. And we have to still sort out a lot of other things. The law is never the answer. Can I have the next slide, please? So we have to start, though, in understanding why we have medical assistance in dying allowed here in Canada now. with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and particularly Section 7, which says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And that section is going to be the crux of what amounts to a change in the law that comes about. But first I want to, with the next slide, explain to you what the law said prior to February 6th of 2015. And up to that date, it was a crime in Canada to assist another person in ending their own life with no exceptions. And therefore, if you had a person who was grievously and irremediably ill, they could not seek medical assistance in dying, and they faced a choice of either ending their own life, perhaps prematurely and by violent or dangerous means, or waiting to die of natural causes. So then, what happens on February 6, 2015? It's a page turner. Next page, please. We have the release of the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Goddard case. And the question that was put to the Supreme Court of Canada very simply was whether that criminal prohibition that puts a person to the choice of premature death or death by natural causes violates the charter rights of that individual to life, liberty, and security of the person. And the court ruled that the prohibition denied people who were suffering from grievous and irremediable medical conditions of the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. I know there's a duplication of that. It says that twice. It's because it's so important. And that prohibition was not in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So there are some things that do deprive us of our liberty, but they are in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So there are people who are deprived of their liberty because they're dangerous to others, right? For example. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada told the government they had 12 months to pull up their socks. So although they said that the provisions of the criminal code were not constitutional, they offended Section 7 of the Charter, the government had 12 months to come up with a new plan. Didn't meet the deadline. There was an election in between, which interfered a little bit, I suppose. And so the government went back to the Supreme Court of Canada just less than a year before that deadline was to expire, and asked for another year and was told, no, you've got 6 months. And in the meantime, we're no longer going to deny people access to medical assistance in dying. And you may recall there was a period of time where people could go to the court and get a court order to allow them to have a medically assisted death. It was very unwieldy, but it was allowed. Okay, so next slide, please. So what is medical assistance in dying? It actually is an exemption of the criminal code. So you're still not allowed to help a person die, except if you meet the conditions that are provided for that provide for the exemption. Okay? And even if somebody consents to your assistance in helping them die, unless it meets the terms of the exemption, you can't help them die without having being charged with a criminal offense, being potentially guilty of what's called culpable homicide. Next slide, please. So the exemption applies only when certain defined health professionals provide specific types of assistance to eligible persons. So it isn't just a broad, sweeping exemption. We still have that in our criminal code. Next slide, please. So the defined health professionals are a medical practitioner or a nurse practitioner or a pharmacist. Pharmacists have to be included because, as you'll see, maybe in the next slide, the means of death is always by a pharmacological means of death. So these are the 2 permitted types of assistance. One is administration of a substance directly by the medical practitioner or the nurse practitioner, and the other is by prescribing, and then the substance is prescribed by the medical or nurse practitioner to the person, and then the person self-administered. And I don't know how much of the latter is actually happening, Karen, do you know?
There's usually, as far as I know, it's the top one.
Yeah, I suspect that as well. Okay, so next slide, please. Here are the conditions in which you can request medical assistance in dying. Some of these were already, I think, covered by Karen in her presentation, but I do want to highlight that, first of all, we don't have sort of forum or venue shopping here. There are some countries in the world where you can go and have a medically assisted death, and you don't have to be a resident of that country. That's not the case here in Canada. You have to be eligible for health services in Canada. You have to be an adult. You have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. There's a typo in the definitions because the word no was left out. On number 4 there, it says they are making a voluntary request with no external pressure, okay? And I think that that whole external pressure question is one that there's going to have to be a lot of discussion about, and some of the things that I've already heard today kind of lead us to the question of what does it mean in terms of external pressure. I just had a phone call this week from a man who is concerned about his mom, who is quite elderly and who sometimes says, I never wanted to live like this. And he was trying to figure out, well, what do I do about this? And isn't it kind of tricky when you're not supposed to put pressure on a person, and really it's the person who should themselves be making the request, but maybe she doesn't know that she is the person who should talk to her doctor, and by me merely suggesting this is a kind of a fraught thing to get into a discussion with your parent about. It's a very tricky situation. And then number 5, you have to give informed consent to receive medical assistance in dying after being informed of the means that are available to relieve your suffering, including palliative care. And then next, the next slide, yes, what is a grievous and irremediable medical condition? You have to have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. You have to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. The illness or disability or state of decline has to cause enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to you and cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable. And it's really important to make the point that this is subjective, right? What is tolerable to me may not be tolerable to you. You don't have to live by my standards, and it has to be what you consider acceptable. Nobody can come to you and say, well, if you received this treatment, you wouldn't be feeling that much pain, therefore you should accept the treatment. That isn't going to be required. It says that natural death has to become reasonably foreseeable, taking into account the person's medical circumstances, but there doesn't have to be a due date. As Karen said, that's really rather impossible. And then there are some safeguards. This is the next slide. I'm promising, I may be a little over my time, but this is my second last slide. So just to highlight some of these, you make the request in writing. There is a way of accommodating someone who can't make the request in writing. The person has to make the request after they've been informed they have the grievous and irremediable medical condition. So you can't sort of say, oh, if I get ALS 5 years from now, I want to have a medically assisted death. You have to have independent witnesses. Some people in this room may even have been, or watching elsewhere, may have actually been asked to be a witness. I know some people who've been asked to be witnesses. And you can withdraw the request at any time. There has to be a written opinion from another independent medical or nurse practitioner that the person meets the criteria. And there's actually definitions in the law about what it means to be independent. Some of them are obvious, some of them maybe less so. Like, for example, if it's your uncle and you're going to inherit from him, you're not independent. 10 clear days between the request and the medical assistance in dying. You have to be told that you can still withdraw immediately before the death, and you must also again give your express consent. And there are ways of addressing communication difficulties in providing for the legislation. Now, last slide. This is the #1 question I get asked by my clients these days. can I give you advance consent to mate? Not under the current law. You must be capable when you make the request, and you must remain capable for that last stage where you are informed that you have the right to withdraw your consent and asked if you want to proceed or not. So that said, as Karen mentioned, there are other things that you can express wishes about when you are mentally capable, and which can provide guidance to the person who will be your substitute decision maker if you are no longer capable of making decisions for yourself. One thing I would say, and I say this all the time to my clients, because I work a lot with older clients and their families, and I see people who live in capacity for 5, 10 years or longer, is that these advanced care plans and advanced directives shouldn't just be about how you want to die, but how you want to live. Because your death is a one event, and 10 years living in long-term care when you're incapable is something else. And so I really encourage people to think about, companionship and about recreation, and, if you enjoy reading, making sure somebody is going to come and read to you when you can no longer read for yourself. And if you enjoy music, making sure that you're going to have access to music. And the food that you like or you don't like, that they're not going to feed you the mashed peas that you hate. And frankly, we see a lot of complaints about people whose grooming is no longer being attended to. And so, I think living in dignity, from my point of view, is as important as dying with dignity. And so I always encourage people to think about those kinds of issues as well when you're contemplating giving advance directives to others about how to make decisions for you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists for all this information we've received. And to give you a little bit of time to digest it, we'll reconvene again about 2:45, and then Walter will be asking the questions that you've brought to us, okay? So 10 minutes. expect you to pose. Okay, and I've asked the panelists, it's both from accessibility for people that have difficulty hearing, as well as for the fact that we are live streaming on the web. If when you answer the question, would you please take the mic and use it, okay?
So I have them all sorted out, they're in long chains, and now they're getting all mixed up. There are a few questions that there may be some fairly short answers for. One, so they fall basically into four broad areas. There's a kind of practical medical question. There are a couple of kind of clarifying questions about the legal issues. There are some questions that have to do with the Anglican Church of Canada, our kind of ecclesial position on this. And there are some other theological questions. And then there are quite a range of people raising questions of a more pastoral nature. And I thought I might maybe take them in that order. And so we'll see how far we get, then we'll have some time in table groups, and then we'll come back and we can keep generating questions as well. So I think the first of these questions, the bottom line was, can a doctor recommend MAID to a patient, and is that ethical? And that came back in another form for Jan as a question about external pressure. There are examples of healthcare professionals suggesting aid to individuals and families. For example, persons with severe disabilities. What is their recourse? So, is this happening? If you could just say something about it.
I think if really the person would be saying something to you, like, I don't consider this any quality of life, doctor. Is there any way that I can call it quits? Then you could introduce me, but I wouldn't be approaching them with me right off the bat. But it's usually the person would be saying something. Donald Lowe, do you remember the fellow that was, okay, I'm sure you all do, and you can remember, that was before May, and he begged to be put to sleep, okay, to die, because he had a brain tumor and considered it no quality of life. And yet, so I think it's been well publicized enough that people at this point are quite aware of it.
Last June, the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, which is a legal aid clinic here in Toronto, there's also income seniors, had a special lecture, and everybody from my firm pretty much attended it, and it was talking about advanced consent, but along the way, this was a professor who'd been one of the scholars who was working on the report that was done in December to the federal government, and they looked at some of the things that are happening in Europe where you can give advanced consent, for example. And one of the examples he talked about really reminded me of how subtle pressure can be, and how a person who is near the end of their life and is suffering can also feel that they are a burden on others, and that raising that conversation with that person, and if you're a loved one of them and you're also in some way a caregiver, can signal to them that you are experiencing the sense of burden. So I think it's a very difficult thing to kind of unpack and figure out in terms of how you can raise that question with a loved one. And I would think that probably the College of Physicians and Surgeons may have some advice for physicians on when, if at all, it's appropriate to raise the topic.
So Jan, while you've got the microphone, there were, I think, some of the questions about whether it could be in living wills and that sort of thing. I think you answered those in your presentation. Taking up that, someone did ask, saying, I know it's illegal at the moment, but what's the rationale for this prohibition? So perhaps if you want to comment, I think, because I think what you said relates to that. And do you see that that advanced consent might change in the near future?
Well, the reason it's not there now is because the changes in the law were responding to the case that was before the Supreme Court. The case was very specific. It was somebody who had a grievous and irremediable condition who was still capable and put forward to the court the question, why can't I request assistance in dying? So typically in the law, we kind of work through things incrementally. We don't tend to make wide sweeping changes in the law without giving a lot of very careful thought to the implications of that. And I think right now what's happening is in this area, the question of advanced consent, as well as the question of whether a mature minor, so somebody who's under the age of 18 but mature, or somebody with a psychiatric illness could also qualify for medical assistance in dying. And one thing we always have to be really cautious about is unintended consequences. There's lots of people who think that things are good ideas, but until you've really studied them and thought them through from all angles, you don't really know, and even then you don't really know what the consequences will be of changing the laws. So as I said in my presentation, lots of people have wanted to, have come to me, my clients, and said, I want to give advanced consent. But what I always say to them is, you're not really going to be the person who makes that decision. And there's never going to be a day, in my view, when everybody wakes up and says, oh, this is the day Jan meant to die. There's going to be somebody else who's going to now make the decision that you are going to die, receive a medically assisted death on that particular date. And that is a very big leap from a conscious, capable person making their own decision. So there are a lot of other considerations there, and I say that not without a considerable amount of sympathy for people who receive a diagnosis and are concerned that someday they won't have the capacity and they will be suffering and they won't be able to have given advanced consent. But it is a much more complicated matter, and that's why we have the Government of Canada commissioning scholars from across the country to advise, Karen's rolling her eyes a bit, but maybe, but to advise on these issues and identify what all the issues are and what the potential consequences are.
Just out of interest, the experience in Oregon, where the route they went involved much more prescribing medications for patients to take home and use them. That accounts for, I think, less than 5% of deaths here. The vast majority are administered. But in the case of Oregon, what they found was a large number of people, and I don't have the percentages in front of me, were requesting assistance in dying, being prescribed the medications in order to do that, and either not filling the prescription or filling the prescription and leaving the medications in a cabinet somewhere. What people say they want in the abstract and what people want in the concrete, we know passage are very, very different. Which is not a reason for not filling in the advance care directive.
You know, I think one of the biggest problems for all of us is if you develop dementia, and if you have gentle dementia, it's not, you can care for the person, you can give them a quality of life. But we have people that have severe dementia that are aggressive. I've learned a lot of Italian words. I'm a puttana. Do you know what puttana is? A whore. Okay, it's one of the issues. But for these poor people, they can have hallucinations and they can suffer quite a lot. And you know, I think for all of us, our biggest question is, if that happened to me when I want to be kept alive, it's a really difficult call. And you know, in soul searching versus in Holland, I know one of the psychiatrists was talking at her hospital where there was a young gal who was in her early 20s who had been sexually abused as a teenager, and she asked to be put to death because she considered she had no quality of life, and they did it. And I'm thinking, but there is a slippery slope. And so, there's the problem of trying to decide what's appropriate and what would we want in the future for ourselves. I don't know if I'm going to be demented. If I do, I want to be a stool slinger. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Okay. I'll get back at everybody, but anyways, that's beside the point.
So actually, another question that's come in, Karen, you may be able to answer. So the question is, which is been sort of touching on in another way, but someone said, how much can a person depend on the system to allow MAID if the 10-day cognitive period is slipping away?
If they no longer can understand what it means to have made, then they cannot have made. During that, once the 10 days is gone, and you come back to them, and at that point say, do you still want made? And they're gaga at that point, no.
So this morning we were told by one of the palliative care physicians from Sunnybrook that 23% of the cases they shortened the 10-day period. That their lawyers are telling them there are ways that can be done.
There must be some legal.
Yeah, and that's been happening. And the issue is where you can see that the cognitive loss is sufficiently quick that it's going to deprive them of the.
But in general.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. It's all complicated.
Yeah.
So it's moved around to Eric, and I think you might be the person for the next questions. I call these two questions, they kind of are church or ecclesial questions. So one question was, does the Anglican Church have a firm opinion or position, pro or con, MAID? If not, what is its opinion? And then the question that seemed to arise for some people out of that is, how does that relate to what's going on, say, in Roman Catholic churches and in other Protestant denominations?
The Anglican Church of Canada has no formal position on MAID. The approach to taking a formal position would be a motion to the General Synod. And while 2 studies have been commended to the Church by the General Synod for study, that does not make them policy. So that's just some clarity. Anglicans generally are, in my experience, somewhat suspicious of policy. There's a way of seeing it. Because policies will always tempt somebody to impose it. I share that suspicion of policy. I think guidelines are real helpful, but remember, one of the articles of faith from the 39 articles is that nothing shall be required of anyone for belief except that which can be plainly proved by the Scripture. In my experience, that's a pretty small playing field. And it certainly doesn't include issues like MAID. There are 6 references to suicide, which is a different issue, but a related issue, in the Bible, and not one of them condemns the suicide, which is really rather interesting to look at. So, just good to remember that. We do not have a firm policy. What I think we have are a series of pastoral and liturgical resources to help the Church to engage people who are engaging these issues and to help their families.
And anything about how this might compare to what's happening with other denominations, as you're aware of?
It will surprise you to know that Anglicans come roughly in the middle, as so often. Clearly, the Roman Catholic Church and certain evangelical churches have a very clear understanding that this is an inappropriate way forward. I would say even in the days of caring and dying, it was a somewhat tentative suggestion that this wasn't the way forward, which even then recognised that there were contrary views and there were things to be weighed. There are other churches who shall be nameless who have been very, very embracing of this. I think either of those extremes gets you into some problem simply because we're talking about human experience in one of the areas we've had the most difficulty talking about. I sometimes joke that I can guarantee the church is going to shoot itself in the foot whenever it talks about either sex or death. And so far I've been proved right. I'd love to be wrong one day, but that is the case. And I think therefore a certain humility and theological restraint is advisable in this area.
Thank you all. I think the plan now is that we'll take about 15 minutes. I'd like you to work in your table group or maybe turn to join another table group and just have some discussion about what you've been hearing, where your thinking is at, what you've been learning, and also if you begin to have more questions, to jot them down, and I'll come around in a few minutes and begin collecting those to add to the list. But when we return, we want to have some more discussion with the panel. There are a range of what I would call, as I said, theological questions, but the bulk of the questions from here on have more to do with how we care pastorally in these situations. And so I think that's where lots of people's questions and thinking are, and hopefully in the last 45 minutes we'll be able to move to those larger theological and pastoral questions. I've received a couple more questions, and I think maybe it would be worth addressing these before moving on to the broader theological questions, although they do have some pastoral overtones. So one question that arose at two different tables is about depression affecting access to MAID and guidelines for someone suffering depression that doesn't respond to treatment. And if anyone has experience of this.
Well, I think you've got to understand there's multiple types of medications nowadays, including shock therapy, by the way, because for some people, especially in the elderly who are resistant to other medications, shock therapy actually works. Okay, I've seen that in a couple of other residents we had in long-term care where nothing else worked. You know, you're on a slippery slope with depression because, you know, you have to look at why are they depressed. It's genetically determined because you see that in people. But there's so many different types of medications, and you just have to try, you know, and you'd be amazed that one drug may not work, but, you know, they have a significant improvement on another medication. There's different types of depression, I guess is the other thing. You lose your spouse. Well, obviously you're going to be depressed over the next year. And part of that is talking and support. Not necessarily even having drugs, but, you know, ever since Tom died, I haven't been the same and so on. But, you know, it depends on the support systems, but I don't see that as a reason for maybe.
It's also the case right now that that's still an issue that's being studied by the federal government. So, to my mind, it's consent, mature minors, and the third is where a mental disorder is the sole underlying medical condition. Those are all things that right now aren't contemplated by the current legislation and are still being studied by the federal government. So depression would fall into that category.
So another question I think probably you can best answer, Karen, was if someone wanted to some clarification about the option of self-administration of the drugs.
Oh, that's easy. You do them. No, they've been assessed, okay, and they've had their 10-day window, and they're deemed appropriate by at least 2 people. Then the medications the physician can prescribe, and they're given to them, and they can take them themselves. So that's an issue. At any time, yeah. But in most cases, if you think if the person is at their terminal event anyways, they're going to be taking it pretty soon. If you're saying at any time, then and it's 3 months later, then the question is, did they really need them at that time anyways?
I'm just thinking the Oregon.
Yeah, the Oregon situation turned out differently.
I think a lot of, were these people properly assessed? And, there's the real question, okay? And by the way, try to get an appointment with a psychiatrist these days. Do you know how long it takes to get an appointment? Okay, unless you're actually going to commit suicide today, it's going to take anywhere from 6 months to a year for you to be seen. Okay, no, but that's the situation, folks, just so you know that. And then if you want to refer to a psychologist, that's not covered. So that means you have to pay. And the cost usually is about $150 an hour. Okay, so just think in those terms, that there's a lot of mental health out in the community. And I can probably go on and on about mental health, but anyways, but just that it's a big issue. That's the reality.
So now I'm going to move on to kind of larger theological and pastoral questions that have been raised. Someone, I think this is more of a theological reflection, who said, why should I be worried with life after death when my soul will be in the hands of my Maker? It's the end of me and my Maker is in control. So an affirmation of position that I know is important for many people. A theological question that's come up in a couple of ways is just to have some clarification of how we understand MAID versus a terminally ill person committing suicide. How do we understand the difference from a theological perspective? I don't know. I'll offer it too.
It's actually a very interesting question, except I really don't think May is suicide simpliciter. So I think him under there is a mixing up of various modes of making decisions. I do think that suicides tend to make their decision and then act on it. It's very individual, it's often quite private, it's deeply shocking to the family when it happens, and I have a number of friends who have experienced suicide in the family, and it is always deeply destructive. That's very different from May, where at the very least, and I would consider this to be quite inadequate, but at the very least, there's a significant conversation between the person contemplating May, the persons who are supporting them in that request, and the physicians who do the assessment. So immediately you've got a much wider scope around the person. And what is, I think, theologically, it's the beginnings of a reminder that who we are in community. Now, I would like to see that community much more developed, and that's really up to us as the church to develop it in advance, I think. It's a bit too late when we're at bedside. So I think that's key. But I think in MAID, precisely because of the process you go through, what you're actually doing is saying, it is enough, Deo Ratio. You're actually accepting the process which is inevitably unfolding, whatever you say. In suicide, it is still a kind of a rage against the process, or can be. And it can be a sign of illness, or it can be a whole number of things. But as I say, suicide tends to be more, not always, but tends to be more individual, tends to be hidden until the event. And that all seems different.
This may be a subtle addition to your comments, Eric, and it's a half-baked idea because I'm still struggling with it myself. But I think also theologically, you can see medical assistance in dying as that within that theological framework where God creates us as people who choose. We have the choice to believe, we have the choice to not believe, we have the choice to be an architect or be a bus driver. We also have the choice as to how our life ends. Versus in the suicide, I agree with you, it might be more imagining despair and the darkness where you feel you don't have a choice. And so when I was part of the Evangelical Lutheran Task Force, we spent a lot of time talking about could May be seen as that celebratory act where the gift that God gives us, that gift being life, is being celebrated by a choosing to die before the life becomes more of a burden than a gift.
Thank you. Do the others have any?
The suicide, the problem with suicide is when you say it's usually associated with severe depression, and when the person makes a decision that they're going to commit suicide, there's often a euphoria that's associated with it. So they go around and say goodbye to all their friends, and they're quite content with what they're going to do. And then if it's a man, he'll jump off the bridge, or he'll stand in front of I know a gentleman that let one of the trains hit him, that kind of awful things. Women just take overdoses. We're smart. We just do ourselves in quietly.
Less messy.
Less messy. Oh, much less messy.
So the pastoral care spectrum, I mean, ranging from the very broad question, what do I need to know with respect to pastoral care on the side of MAID, But perhaps as a kind of opener on this, which we may want our panelists to speculate a little bit, someone posed the question, why do clergy not spend more sermon time talking about death and its inevitability? Well, you know, it may be the same reaction as some of us had to hear in Job this morning. I'll take the blame, I chose Job. You know, that it's too gloomy to talk about. But it's an interesting question, and then coming on from that, they added to the question, why aren't clergy encouraging parishioners to talk with their families more, documenting wishes, examining what matters to them and why. So that's a kind of range of questions. So maybe we might want to start. You may want to speculate more about that.
I've argued for a long time that one of the most significant products of organized religion is the language and the constructions that we build around life and death, the transition from one to the other, what might be on the other side, what might not be on the other side. And I don't believe that organized religion spends enough time talking about that, whether it's from the pulpit or all sorts of other forums. There can be study groups, there can be private personal conversations. A lot of churches nowadays sponsor death cafes, which happen on a regular basis throughout the year, and the intention behind it is that you come to the cafe and literally over coffee and muffins, you explore particular aspects of end-of-life care, of power of attorneys, and you talk about that thing that falls under the great category of death, my death. So I think there are ways that churches can do it, and I think clergy need to be challenged by their congregations to bring that matter forward and to explore it in creative and interesting ways. I've just been told today that St. James Cathedral in Toronto is planning a series on spirituality and death in the fall, so look forward to those dates and mark them in your calendar and plan to come.
We're also planning an event in the fall in terms of preparing for death, including advanced care, wills, all those sorts of things, some reflection for folk. So it does happen, it doesn't happen enough. And I would say that part of why it doesn't happen enough is historical. Through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, there was a whole preoccupation with what were called the ars morendi, the arts of dying. And I would have to say it became pretty morbid. And it became detached from the other half of the equation, which was the ars vivendi, the arts of living. And I think we need to recouple those and revisit at least some of the learnings from the reflection of those times. I'm not into having skulls on my desk or anything like that, which was part of what started to happen, but we do need to recover a sense of that, because last time I checked, with all the advances in healthcare, death rate remains the same. 1 out of 1. And that's even true for Anglican congregations. So we absolutely need to be talking about this more than we are doing. Being also a little serious, one of the realities is that anyone in parish ministry will tell you happily what a struggle it is to get people into any form of faith formation activity. It's a real struggle, and that's not just my experience, that's the experience of clergy everywhere I've ever been. So it's not just about a lack of preparedness around issues of death and dying, it's a lack of integration of my faith with the whole gamut of life and of the things that I do think about and am engaged in.
I just want to add that lawyers in my field never talk about death. And I keep putting it on, you know, those evaluation forms you fill out at the end of a continuing professional development program. I always say, why don't we get together and talk about death? And nobody ever takes me up on it. We never have that as a topic on the next round of CPD programs. So I think there's another reflection of how we push that stuff to the margins. So even though in my area of the legal profession we're dealing with death and planning for death all the time, we never talk about it. It is an area of personal interest to me. I can't speak about that in cafes, but it was a really interesting piece of paper a few months ago about a man who has been hosting these death dinners around the globe, really. Have either of you heard of these? And it's kind of become a movement. There have been hundreds of them around the globe where people get together. Sometimes they don't even really know each other. And they sit down and they talk about death over dinner. And I also read recently about a family that have an annual event where they sit down and they talk about death. And I think maybe these kinds of things can help people kind of break down that reluctance to talk about it. And I often think, and I have 3 sons now in their 20s, that you have to do it when the family is still relatively young, and that people push these conversations off until it's too late to really have the conversation without being fraught with an overlay of, I know you're dying, I know you're sick, I know you're looking after me. I know I've been repeating that theme over the course of my remarks today, but I do think it makes the conversation much more difficult.
I'll just make a couple of comments. I was at St. Paul's Rexdale for years, because St. Cuthbert's is only the last couple of years, because I moved. But anyways, interesting enough, for a sermon, so this is where I think it should be, sermon on Sunday, not separate groups. The only time you're going to catch a lot of people is on Sunday, one hopes. Okay, is that they actually had me talk about powers of attorney, and living wills, and so on. And it's interesting, I brought in a book with I think I brought in 100, and they asked for about 50 afterwards, which means that you can tell that a lot of people hadn't seriously thought about it. I think it's something that should be brought up on Sundays, okay, so maybe you can catch more people that way, because everybody has busy lives, that's the excuse, so you have something that lets you know you can't guarantee they're going to be there, right? So I just make that comment.
So then we had, thank you, that was, I think, a helpful discussion. I've certainly often reflect on the degree to which our whole society is a kind of deeply embedded in death in all sorts of ways, dealing it all around the world, and yet it's something that we also refuse to talk about and deny a lot as a society. This one is a kind of very focused and practical pastoral question. If assisted death is something you want, but a child or children, adult children, this person notes, don't want to let you go, what happens?
Too bad. You have the right, you're speaking of autonomous, you have the right to make your own decisions. And just because your kids say we don't want it, I'm comfortable with making that decision, I want it done, we have to respect that person. Anybody else?
Unfortunately, I think that's one of the good examples of when possibly good pastoral care intervention might be useful, where you sit down, it's a very possibly long and unfocused process where you get the people who are in opposition to that decision to understand why, and to understand that probably most likely it's their own needs that they're listening to or feeling, and that they need to work their way through that. I think that's one of the places where a community of faith can be a very long-term, whether it's a day or a week or a month, a long-term resource to help those who are in opposition to something like that express it, explore it, and possibly resolve it in a different way, who knows. But sometimes it just breaks down and it remains the patient's decision, and the conflict is a conflict that then could rest in a wounded
I think it's another example of why we need to be in a fast sooner. Very simply, you're absolutely right, it's the patient's decision. But if we reach the point where the patient is trying to make a decision and the family are utterly, or some of the family are utterly opposed, then we've got a fractured family, and we've added tragedy to loss. And you know, there's going to be no easy way back from that at that point. There's going to be long-term care for the remaining family afterwards. From my point of view, I can't say well. Tough luck. I've got to care for the family who were not able to deal with that. But I think there's a real need to get in there. This is where having longer-term relationships and encouraging conversations within the family and supporting those conversations can make a huge difference. But I think that's where it has to be.
The worst example that I've encountered was when I helped a fellow colleague of mine problem solve a pastoral response where the parent engaged in MAID without letting any of the children know, because the understanding was very clear that the children would be in opposition to it. So the children actually found out after MAID had taken place, because it was, of course, the individual's right to make those decisions and to decide who was part and parcel of the process towards a MAID decision. Those children were not members of the congregation, really didn't have any card-carrying or even little bitty pocket Bible faith. So the question was there a pastoral care role in that circumstance? But obviously that was a significant rift in a family constellation.
If I make comments. Family dynamics are awful. You know,
They're wonders.
there's always the favorite child who go through this business, and then the other child that feels guilty and tries to do everything for the parent, and the parent gives them no positive reinforcement at all, and everything rides on the son who, is a jerk, but the son rises and sets on him, and yet the daughter tries to do everything for the mother, and the mother doesn't appreciate. I'll tell you, and then we have the families where there's four and would be supporting me and the one that isn't, and you're never going to change them. That's what I see. And then afterwards, wait until you see if there's money. That gets even better, okay? Because then half the time afterwards, if there's some money around, they never talk to each other afterwards once the money's put up. I'm being bitchy today.
Thank you all. What's kind of interesting in the responses was it took back to some of what Eric talked about at the beginning about a kind of propositional way of doing ethics, or beginning to imagine ethics as unfolding within a narrative. And I mean, here we kind of see the tension between those two things. There's a broad question, which I think we touched on some elements of it, and I'm just going to say what the question was, which was what psychological emotional care do those nearing death need, and how do you provide it? It's a big question, but there are three questions relating to hospice care, and we have about 5 minutes, and I thought maybe I'd move on to them. I'd also offer an interesting reflection. I have a field ed student this year who attended a workshop. Auto workers in Richmond Hill, I think it was. 100 or more people were attending this event on palliative care. And he was the first person that they'd ever had attend who was a clergy person or in training to be clergy, which I just found a kind of fascinating piece of data. What did that mean? So there are resources as well out there in terms of thinking about the psychological and other needs, emotional needs of people approaching death. But the questions about hospices, some of them are kind of more pragmatic, but I think these are people who are also thinking about the action areas. We Anglicans like our action areas. One was, are there funded hospices? Another question is palliative care easy to find, and if not, what can we do about that? And there's also a question from someone who wonders if made, is a kind of slippery slope in terms of how we're approaching long-term care. So there's a kind of suspicious side to the question. So I'm happy to hear from anyone.
Are hospice services easy to find? I would say generally no. You really have to kind of scrub around for it. Are there enough palliative care resources? No. The government, people should be agitating the government. I don't know how you do that in today's Ford era. For more healthcare funding for palliation. I don't believe that it is a slippery slope because I believe there are enough, there's a sufficient enough container to be built around our current practice of MAID that if that breaks out in any kind of direction to liberalize the process, that's going to be a long and difficult conversation, so I don't think anything's going to happen quickly. What was the third one? Or the first one?
Well, the third one was about, generally, is the whole MAID discussion and approach, is it a kind of slippery slope in terms of how how our society approaches long-term care? So it's a kind of suspicious question.
Personally, I don't think so. I remember when I used to work with a paleontologist about Sinai for many years, and she had a very strong belief that what our current society has done is that we've turned dying into a long, high-tech, chronic dying versus embracing not necessarily an enthusiastic understanding of death, but a more realistic understanding of death. I personally don't think it's a slippery slope as far as long-term care is concerned. I think we have more than enough work to do to enhance the dignity of long-term care than anything else.
Regarding the slippery slope, I agree with you. I don't think this is a slippery slope, but what I would observe, and this goes much more broadly than me, is that we have in death and dying combined denial with increasingly technological approaches to death and dying, and the prioritization of control. And I think it's precisely that notion of control that makes our assessment of appropriate levels of autonomy very difficult and gets us into some of the knots that we've talked about. There was actually a book published in the 70s called The Last Thing We Talk About. You may vaguely remember that. A pastoral care book. And I think that's still the case. And even in churches, I hear people using euphemisms which avoid addressing the reality of death and loss. And I avoid that myself, mostly, but every now and again I get anxious with somebody and I start to use the same euphemisms and realise that that's actually not that helpful, because it really doesn't help us to address the reality of our own mortality. And maybe that's why we use denial so much, because this has the nasty habit of reflecting eventually back on ourselves. And yes, it's nice to know we'll be in the hands of God afterwards, but that doesn't seem to be quite enough for most people to deal with the high levels of anxiety and fear about the process of dying.
I too don't think it's a slippery slope, and I want to endorse what's already been said about long-term care. And what I feel is the real need to focus on the quality of life in long-term care, which I believe can exist but doesn't exist enough. I also when I talk to clients about planning for their deaths, I never use euphemisms. And I think it's because it's my own little personal mission to call things what they actually are. But death denial is everywhere. Last year I did a deathbed will. I don't always do it every year, but it's really interesting to do a will for somebody who dies 24 hours after they sign it. That's pushing it to the limit, but an experience that I see from time to time in my practice.
certainly MAID is not, we're not on a slippery slope that way. Our biggest problem is lack of beds. Because if you look at the waiting list for my home, I think our waiting list is 4 years. So just to get, so you can appreciate that many of the residents, when they come in, they may last 6 months to 9 months and pass on. And is that a good translation? Okay. Yes. Thank God. Okay, thank God. Okay. So, you know, but the care is much heavier than what it was in years gone by the time the person does get to long-term care. Obviously, we would like more funding so that we could have more staff, but you know, there's a budget and we have to go by the budget. If families have additional money, they will have private support care for residents, which of course gives better quality of life for the residents, but welcome to reality. I'm not sure how you guys know how much it costs to be in long-term care. Because, you know, that's the other issue. If you plan ahead and you've got money, yay, but not everybody does. If you're in residential care, that's going to cost you somewhere about $4,000 to $5,000 a month. If you want a private room in long-term care, it's going to cost maybe about $2,800 a month. But then if you want your hair done, you want your toenails cut, you need dentistry and all that, that's all extra. None of that's covered, so leave your buried. Okay, so, but you know, we try our best, okay? And we try to communicate as much as possible. When you're talking about palliative care outside of long-term care, I think it is what's available through home care. And when we, you know, but people that are trying to stay at home, the amount of hours that can be given to them, ideally, they don't get. Okay, so maybe if you're lucky, you get about 2 hours for bathing, 1 hour twice a week for bathing, and then the family's left to do the rest. The biggest problem nowadays, how many families can afford to live in a city like Toronto that you don't have both the husband and wife working? So if you've got a 75-year-old lady that's got, it doesn't matter what she has, Alzheimer's, I'll just say. So her daughter's working, she's 50, the husband's working as well. So what are you supposed to do for that person? Well, you could set up daycare if she's not a wanderer. So there's daycare programs where they can pick the person up. I think that's about $35 a day. I hope I'm doing this right. But it does give the family a break. There is respite care. Respite care is, let's just say you decided you want to go on a holiday and your mom cannot go with you, then she can be admitted to the facility for a couple of weeks so that you have the relief, which mental sanity-wise goes a long way. Okay, and so, you know, we're trying, but it's the population. We're all aging. Okay, and that aging population, no matter what, how many people are 80 and are on no meds? Okay, and the more medication you give people, the more confusion you create. And I sometimes look in horror at some of the drugs that I have people on and think, is there anything that I can stop? Unfortunately, the protocols now for a lot of things, like if you're in congestive heart failure, or if you have glaucoma and you're on 5 eye drops, and don't kid yourself, a lot of people are on 5 different eye drops for it. So the amount of, and can you picture if you're 85 and you're at home and you're supposed to be putting drops in your eyes with your arthritic neck that you're supposed to be bending back and putting these drops in? There's lots of stuff like that. So we have not planned for the future well. We have not planned for the elderly.
Thank you. I can tell we opened up an interesting one there. Thank the panelists for engaging with the questions, and we have one more little task to ask them to do.
Yeah, we just very quickly, in one sentence, if each one of you could say, what was the one thing you would want people to remember about today? What's one important point you want them to take home?
MAID is now a legal reality in this country. It, I don't think, is excusable for a cleric or a community leader to not learn about MAID and to struggle with their own thoughts and feelings and come to resolutions within their own soul as to where they stand around MAID. And I think everyone has the opportunity to become an advocate for it, at least the conversation around it.
The call of anyone in pastoral ministry is to care. And that care is without limit and without boundaries. So we're not just to care for people who like us, we're not just to care for people who agree with us, we're not just to care for people whose decisions we approve of. We're called to a care that is sacramental of the unlimited love and self-offering of God. That's the call. And in this area and in many others that have been controversial and difficult in the life of the church, we frankly need to realize it's not up to us. Our job is to love and care in the midst of the situations we find ourselves in.
I think the word that's occurred to me is respect, to be respectful of the choices of others, and to try to honor them as much as we can.
As always, I'll say, speak up, powers of attorney and living wills. And please do them, it makes it so much easier as a physician.
Okay. Can we express our appreciation for our panelists? And I'd also like to thank Reverend Heather, who's at the Church of the Incarnation with a small group of people that are taking part in our live broadcast and watching us. And Tay advises us that we've had up to 9 people watching us at home as well at any point in time. So it's a topic people are still talking about and still need to talk about. So Bishop, if you'd like to come forward and close us with prayer. We have a small gift for each of you. We really, truly appreciate all the work you put into being here today.
Thank you, Jeanette. Let me just echo your comment from a moment ago that we are enormously blessed to have had the opportunity to be here in this room. For those who have tuned in by live stream, to be able to see this live. And also for people who hear about this in the days and weeks ahead, to be able to visit the YouTube page and see it. So thank you. The 4 of you have just been extraordinary. And I just sitting in the back of the room and having an opportunity to hear reflections from each of your areas of specialty and expertise, medicine, law, ethics and priestly ministry, pastoral care, chaplaincy and priestly ministry. It has just been marvelous. And I know we've already done this, but maybe we just put our hands together again and thank our 4 speakers today. I would also like to thank the clergy and people of St. Andrew's Scarborough, and Marjorie in particular, for the food. I think Marjorie put together the food for today. And the folks at St. Andrew's often host things not only in York Scarborough, but in the life of our diocese. We are grateful to you for providing this space. And let me say once again our thanks to Tay Moss, Walter Deller, and Jeanette Lewis for their work in pulling this day together. If you are able, would you please stand? Let us pray together. Glory to God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we could ask or imagine. Glory to God from generation to generation, in the Church and in Christ Jesus, forever and ever. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Alleluia.
Thanks be to God. Alleluia.
Thank you for being with us today.